guest this week is career U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Ambassador Pickering formerly served as U.S. Ambassador to 6 different countries, including Russia, and was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. He currently serves as Vice Chair of the international consulting group Hills and Company. Ambassador, good to sit and chat with you once again.
Dennis, I'm delighted to be back. Thank you.
I want to talk about Russia today. And you served as our ambassador there about 20 years ago?
Some time ago.
Yeah. What would you say of Russia today, or to focus on
I see Russia today as having a combination of some stability, some economic advance, great distances between rich and poor, afflicted heavily by corruption, which has become not just a science, but an art form in many ways. And very little is being done to deal with it unless the government wants to go after particular individuals. And they can make, put it this way, they keep a book on everybody whose head is sticking above the horizon, particularly if they're getting into politics. And so we see that. There are people demonstrating in the streets in the new middle class, which is growing. There's been a lot of investment because Russia for the last 20 years has in fact enjoyed both the benefits and the disasters of a monocrop. The monocrop in Russia is petroleum. And Russia has in fact had times when $100, $120 barrel of oil made a real difference in the income. Some of that unfortunately siphoned off into personal pockets. But some of it plowed back into the economy, into building, into new infrastructure, but not enough. And other times when prices fell and things got very bad, 2008, 2009. What they have, however, learned to do, which is bad, is they've learned to live off of a budget for the state based on higher and higher prices of oil. So a few years ago, the budget was at $40 oil. Now it may be close to $100 oil or more, and if the oil price falls below that, then they have to go back and eat savings. The other thing that the Russians have learned is that over time they were able to put aside sometimes as much as $600 billion in foreign exchange earnings from the oil as a cushion against change. Unfortunately, the change, particularly in 2008 and 2009, quickly ran that cushion down below the danger point. And so they had to really struggle to get their house back in order and to move things ahead. So they haven't taken advantage of the enormous benefits of the monocrop to pluralize the economy, further to invest, but they've relied heavily on the notion that oil is scarce, it's going to continue to get scarcer, and therefore we're going to continue to be in the catbird seat.
Where did the relationship with Obama and Putin go wrong?
I think it went wrong in a number of ways. I think it went wrong in part because they had different visions of the world, in part because their personalities were vastly different. Putin is a health fanatic. He's an exercise fanatic. He's a do-everything out there, mountain climber, skier, strongman, pugilist, the whole thing. President Obama is a deeply intellectual man, one who thinks about subjects, is strategizing, tries to think ahead, brings to the public the challenge of new ideas. I think his problem has been that the ideas have outstripped the capacity to make the government perform as he would hope. And he has, in effect, collected many enemies. I wish, this is a hard thing for me to say, Dennis, but I'll say it. Russia is a country in which prejudice still holds sway. Anti-Semitism is underlying much of Russian belief. Much of the Russian Far East, when I was there, I don't think it's changed radically. Of the 10 million people who lived east of Lake Baikal in Siberia, quite a ways out, it was hard to know anybody out there who wasn't deeply concerned by Chinese, Do you remember the words, the yellow peril? And as a result, they were extremely prejudiced against Chinese and to some extent Koreans, thinking they would come over the border of China and take over the wealth. The Russian attitude in mainland central Russia is to be negative about dark people. And for them, the Caucasus is where dark people begin. And the Russian word chorny, black, characterizes, and I'm afraid that there may be racial stereotyping going on in the Obama-Putin relationship. I'm sorry to say it. I want to say it as carefully as I can. I only suspect that there's some of that. So there was a mismatch of personalities, a mismatch in some ways of perhaps central focal points, and perhaps some sorts of misestimation that went on that has not helped that relationship to get where it should be. It's a very important relationship.
I want to take a little break. When we come back on the other side, I want to talk with Ambassador Pickering about the Olympics and what's at stake, what's riding on the Olympics for Putin and Russia. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Ambassador Tom Pickering. They call him a career U.S. ambassador, which is about as high a designation as you can get in the Foreign Service here in the United States. He has been ambassador to 6 different countries, including Russia, and ambassador to the United Nations, representing us. He has a whole host of other credits on his resume as well. But let's hold right there. Take a little break. Back on the other side. This is America and the World. This is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing and distribution services. What's riding on the Olympics with Russia and Putin?
Mr. Putin, like his predecessors, is, I think, if not mesmerized, heavily preoccupied with Russia's great power status. And it motivates much of what he does.
And that's a term, right? Great power status?
It is. Of course, in the Cold War, of course, the Russians wanted to be the other great power with the United States and fought hard in many ways to achieve that particular situation. I think one of the attractiveness of doing a deal with the United States over destroying Syria's chemical weapons was that there we stood side by side on the platform together, working hard to do something that was in fact good. Years ago, Russia played an important role in helping to resolve a conflict between India and Pakistan in Tashkent and Uzbekistan. And that particular episode, the Russians publicized as the spirit of Tashkent. They did that alone. And so they want this. And so Sochi and the Olympics represent for Russia a second opportunity after the Moscow Olympics, which collapsed over the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And now he has a new chance to put his stamp on the new Russian Olympics and to show the rest of the world that they're not a second-class state. They're a major world power. They know how to do things well. They can conduct this great challenge. You remember how successful the Chinese were, and indeed the Japanese recently, in meeting the Olympic goals. And so he's up against some first-class competitors here, and he wants to show, in fact, that he, Putin, and Russia are in the big leagues, in the world class. And so that, I think, is motivating this. It motivates other ideas of his. He wants to certainly put his umbrella up, if I could put it this way, back over the old former Soviet Union, the Central Asian states, the Caucasus, those that have become independent on the eastern border, even perhaps the Baltics, although the Baltics are the most resistant for all kinds of reasons. And so we need to look at this as part of the motivation, and we need to look at this as the test. And you and I chatting before the program, you mentioned something that has been very clear, that he's let a number of people who have been highly controversial, who have in fact motivated Western leaders to seek their release. Mr. Khodorkovsky from Yukos, among them.
The big oil company.
Big oil company that he, in effect, confiscated. And others that we have seen.
The rockers.
The rockers, yeah.
And the
Pussy
activists,
Riot girls, yeah.
And the Greenpeace activists.
And the Greenpeace activists and Mr. Navalny and others. And so, in effect, he is moving in what we would call the kinder, gentler mode, along with what he hopes will be the outstanding success of Sochi, both with its facilities and I suspect with the Russian sense for the performing arts. Russia in ballet is unrivaled, but also in classic opera. And so he brings, if I could put it this way, a long Russian tradition to the stage of excellence in those areas. And it'll be fascinating to see, in fact, one, is this going to be done? And I suspect, despite all of the negative comments now, because I've watched Russians perform in a pinch, that they have an enormous capability at the last minute of making things work. So don't sell them short. Secondly, they have an enormous, I think, feeling for musical performance, for dance, for ballet, the kind of things that everybody has shown in exemplary fashion that they can do as part of the opening and closing shows for the Olympics. So let's see what they do. Let's see how they stack up. The really interesting thing, I think, Dennis, is their life after the Olympics in what is basically a new face. Is this a temporary new face for show?
Good.
Or is this a new opportunity? I would hope it's a new opportunity, but I'm not sure it is, because its superficial aspects tend to be, in my view, more salient than the long-term one.
How about the recent bombings? Is terrorism going to show its horrible, ugly head during this time?
It has been for some time. We've had bombings before. You remember the famous theater instance, Nordost.
Yes.
You remember the apartment buildings that came down before the Second Chechen War under Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, now President Putin. You remember the fact that we've had recent bombings. And so one of the favorite terrorist approaches in Russia is the use of explosives. Now, they often tend to blame this on minorities, and there is clearly, for the Russians, a minority problem among the Islamists in the Caucasus, along their southern border, particularly in Chechnya and the neighboring republic in the Russian system of Dagestan, and others. And they haven't yet solved the problem of how to deal with that. They have a strong man, a Chechen, who is in fact running Chechnya for them, but it hasn't suppressed all of the dissidents. And that may be a diplomatic nicety. It may be a hell of a lot tougher than dissidents. But in Dagestan, too, where you have 17 major minorities operating, you have a problem of violent opposition. And the Russians, I think, are clearly concerned, as they need to be, that the 20 million Muslims or so in the Russian Federation not be lured by what is the siren song of the new fundamentalism into violent opposition to the state, the use of terror and bombing, and we share a common view there. We and the Russians, I think, look at terrorism in much the same way and have the same set of deep concerns. Some of the terrorism is obviously because they don't want to be part of Russia. And some of the terrorism is basically because they're xenophobic. They're against outsiders. They're anti-Christian, or they're anti-Jewish, or whatever it is that might be.
The State Department has just issued a warning about travel to the games. Would you go?
I tend to think that if I were a sports fanatic, which I'm not, that might persuade me that it was useful and interesting to go. I think the Russians will concentrate huge efforts. There was a recent story in the paper about large numbers of members of the American FBI going to support the common effort in not seeing the games, if you could put it this way, blown up, But you and I remember the tragedy of Munich years ago, where people took advantage of the games, and indeed the international attention on the games to seek to find ways to exploit that to demonstrate their concerns about their own position, in this case, Palestinian violence against Jewish athletes.
It's a vast country, huh?
Huge.
How many, what's the population, ballpark?
Well, ballpark, what, 180 million maybe? Okay. I don't hold me on that
one.
Yeah.
But then 11 different time zones?
11 time zones.
And
of course, you're up near the North Pole. If you're at the North Pole, you're in 24 time zones all at one time. So you have to understand that time zones are time zones. The further north you go, the narrower they are.
I hadn't thought of it that way.
Sure.
But that's not the way my mind works. So the
it's still very big. It's still the biggest expanse of territory under the control of any one state.
Culture. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He said, wonderful people, but they've either been beaten up or beaten down for such a long period of their history.
Yeah, yes and no. I think there are exceptional people in Russia. I came to like Russians very much, to believe that they brought special talents to their own lives. They have an extremely deep history, the same way that Persians do, the same way that many other ancient countries do. They have been occupied by others. They live in a flat land, few natural boundaries. And at the same time, they have developed their own uniqueness. And so you look at Russian genius, it is not limited to music or poetry or space or technology. The Russians have had a great fascination over the years with mathematics, and they produced some of the world's best mathematicians. They've produced some of the world's best scientists.
Scientists, yeah,
absolutely.
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
And they still do. I think that the Russians need to do everything they can to protect their educational system from mediocrity. I worry about the American educational system falling into too much mediocrity. And we have a challenge there. They have a challenge the same way. We should be talking to each other about it. When I was ambassador, we had members of the U.S. Department of Education, which controls very little but looks after educational standards. And they came over and talked about American textbooks. And I sat in on the meeting and I said, you know, to my American colleagues, you better start looking at Russian textbooks on math. We aren't hacking it. If the textbooks are what's helping them, it's a two-way street on some of these things, and we have a tendency not to think about it that way. And they have a tendency to feel slighted as a result of our failure to understand their strengths as well as their weaknesses.
We can't call it a democracy. It's really a dictatorship, isn't it?
Yes and no. It has elements of both.
Okay. I like your diplomatic answer.
No, but it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, they have elections. Sometimes the elections don't turn out the way people expected. And sometimes the elections are carefully managed. They have, in effect, a party that is the state party.
Let me ask you this. I'm fascinated if I'm on the right track here. The media attention goes to Putin always.
Well,
but I read a couple of articles that suggested that behind the scenes were businessmen and bureaucrats who were really invested in seeking power and money and privilege, and that Putin was kind of the referee.
Oh, sure.
Is that a characterization
of what's going on? It is a characterization.
Is that fair enough?
There was a famous story that when Putin first came in, he was deeply concerned that the wealthy Russians then ran the television system, and they could determine the outcome of elections. And so, in effect, he is supposed to have brought in the wealthy leadership of Russia and said, look, I will never ask where you guys got your money, but I never want to see your guys supporting a political arrangement that runs against me. He said that in a careful way. You guys stay out of politics and I'll stay out of how you made your money. And Mr. Khodorkovsky, who he just released, is supposed to have broken that particular deal.
Sure. He was a tycoon.
Well, and he wanted, and he was beginning to run people from his company in political life and beginning to make contributions to people Putin wasn't particularly enamored of.
So these people are really not so focused on ideology. they're focused on money and power and privilege, huh?
So what else is new here, Dennis?
Their foreign policy, I'm going to take a couple of minutes here.
Yeah.
Their foreign policy is, when you look at what was going on in Ukraine and Georgia, and he's playing hockey with Belarus and Armenia and things like that, is he kind of like, he threatens his neighbors, and does he think he can recreate the Soviet Union? I mean, what is his foreign policy, Putin's foreign policy?
Several things. One, there is a strong sentiment in Russia, and has been over the years, partly because of the rule by strong leaders beginning with czars and ending with secretaries general and maybe with presidents. Secondly, there is a deep concern that if a strong central rule does not hold sway, Russia, in all of its diversity and vastness, will become subject to fragmentation. In a very deep sense of anguish over the potential for fragmentation and even worse, civil war. And Russia in the early 1920s lived through a horrible civil war. That memory is only now fading. And that was one of the things at the time of the fall of communism that permeated Russian feeling very greatly. A sense that not only were these republics gone from the Soviet Union, but it might attack the center of the Russian Republic itself. And the Far East was looked at, and perhaps the Islamic areas, and perhaps other minority areas. So getting back to the strong leader, the Russian word is vlast, for strong leadership. That was an important concomitant for many Russians who said we would rather have a little poorer economic performance if we could avoid the tragedy of war and disaster. And so they were called upon with that. And Putin, when he came in, felt things had gone too far, that too many governors of the Russian equivalents of our states had set up too much of their own economy, had set up too much of an independent rulership. They were elected. And so Putin tried to, put this way, gather that back into the center. And he tried to do that by eliminating elections and doing appointments. Some of that has now shifted back again. So it is not all centrally purposed as it has been in the past. And one wants to watch that. He didn't like the idea of competing parties. And they were in many ways minimized. The parties who supported his approach somehow did a little better than the parties who were what we would call modern Western liberal reformers, who he thought would be a danger, who would unhinge the state. That plus the central position of Russia as a major world power and a determiner of where things will go, the Russian capacity to understand that a state which is the world's biggest treasure house of petroleum and raw materials somehow should be able to move that into a position where it has world leadership that accompanies it. That hasn't quite happened. That's the struggle. But it is all part of the Russian vision of where they should be. I think they understand their limits to what I would call imperial expansion. But there are some limits that they would like to set aside and minimize in terms of places where the Russian language and old Russian influence had sway, in which they'd like to bring back in closer to their orbit, as I could put it that way. They're worried, too, about China. They have the longest border with China. China is growing. If you look across the Amur River in the Far East, on one side there are 100 million Chinese almost within sight. On the other side, less than 10 million Russians and huge resources. So just wait till winter and the river freezes. You know, people could walk across.
Wow.
So that is a sense of Russian uncertainty. And indeed, one of the reasons why I think the Russians are so fascinated by tactical nuclear weapons in their inventory is they see those as the ultimate defense against any future Chinese effort to move into these areas. And of course, historically, some of these areas were parts of China in the days of the Tsar, and they were taken over by Tsarist expansion. And so there is the potential for danger there. Right now, Russia and China have ordered their relationship pretty well. Russia sells modern airplanes, military airplanes, to China, but not too modern. But they do some. And they themselves have tried to resolve problems along the border. But there are increasing numbers of Chinese who are traders, who move into that part of Russia, who small traders who make a living in that part of the world.
We're at the end of our time. Actually, we're over our time, but we'll put it all together.
Dennis, you're so good. You make time go in a twinkle of the eye.
Tom, thank
you very
so much.
Great seeing you.
Good to see you again,
terrific
and
to see
Happy
you
New
again.
Year.
Happy New Year, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For information about my new book, The Chance of a Lifetime, and online video for all This Is America programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net. And now you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This Is America is brought to you by the National Education Association, the U.S.-China Education Trust, and the F.Y. Chang Foundation. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.